Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
So we are very pleased to have Raisa D'Souza here, who is at the University of California at Davis. She was a postdoc with us in Redmond, and then she actually was one of the early members of the search product team, and then she decided to go off and do other things with her life, and so we're going to hear about some of the other things that she's been doing. And she's here for a few months now, right?
Yeah.
You
I
just
haven't given you
extended
I will
your
extend
trip
it.
through the middle of December, right?
Correct.
Good.
Okay, so thank you for being here. I hope no one feels obligated. But I hate making people do things. It's definitely hard to get my students, since I try not to obligate people. Is this mic level okay? Yeah? So I'm at UC Davis, and kind of similar to Saul, you'll see that I'm in mechanical engineering and computer science, and perhaps neither of those have to do with my research. They have a little bit to do with it. And I'm also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute, which is a really interesting place that was founded 25 years ago to study complex systems. So they do a lot of really cool lectures, workshops, summer schools for students. So it's definitely a place that I would encourage people to send students to. So I've been studying networks for the last few years. Why? They're very interesting things. There's lots of properties about them. And networks are really ubiquitous. So we see them in so many different circumstances, right? So we have biological networks of proteins interacting with each other, genes regulating, computer networks, information networks, social networks. So we're interested in things like epidemics flowing on those contacts, e-commerce, flow of diffusion of information, things like that. And we also have transportation networks, power grids, critical infrastructure. So they're all networked systems that we rely on fundamentally. And one of the things that's most interesting to me is that they're actually very much interacting. So what do I mean by that? Well, like a biological network, a virus is a biological network, and it's going to spread on a human contact network embedded by large links from transportation networks. So they're all interacting systems. Likewise, computer networks rely on the power grid, and the power grid also relies on computer networks because they have control systems in place that rely on information flow. So they're interconnected networks. In the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of work come out on something called network science, which is kind of trying to understand similarities and differences, things that unify all these kinds of networks, what makes them different. So we see that some of them are geometric and some of them are virtual. Like the internet is a geometric system where there's actually cost to links. The World Wide Web is a virtual network that's overlaid on that. Some of them are natural, like biological systems. Some of them are engineered. Each network might optimize something different, and really this is one of the interesting things is similarities and differences that might help us design, understand, control, or maintain networks. And this is one of the big open questions: what's the connection between topology and function of networks? So one thing that's been observed commonly across all these different kinds of networks is that they have a very broad variation in the degree of the node. So what's the degree of a node? It's how many edges are incident to it. So if we look at the distribution of edge degrees for all the nodes, we see that they're very broad. So I have three examples here. This is a social network, so the probability of observing an individual with K contacts versus K. This is airport traffic, so the number of airports that have a certain amount of flights in the US. And this is a protein interaction network, so how many proteins interact with how many other proteins. And we see that they have very broad scale, so they span several orders of magnitude. So we see a few nodes that have very high degree that are like hubs, and many nodes that are very lowly connected. So this is something that we've seen in many networks. There's lots of disclaimers. They're real systems, they're small, they're finite, they're limited data sets. We don't really know exactly what the functional form is of them. But a lot of these functional forms, yeah, exactly, which is often called a power law. So this is sort of the starting point. People started thinking about these broad-scale degree distributions and approximating them as power laws. And I do want to put this disclaimer here. I am not claiming at all that networks have power law degree distributions. I'm just going to tell you some interesting properties about power laws. And it was really the starting point of a lot of the field. So what does that mean? It means the probability of observing something with degree k goes as some normalization constant times k to the minus gamma log. It looks like a straight line with slope minus gamma. And has everyone heard this term scale-free network? I'm glad there's a couple no's, because this is one of my biggest pet peeves. It's a term that's been used very frequently, but what it really means is that you have a power law degree distribution. It says nothing about other kinds of scales or other features or dimensions of these networks. So it just means that the degree distribution follows a power law, and that's been classified by this very broad, all-encompassing term called scale-free networks. And they're called scale-free because power laws have these interesting properties that if you multiply your variable by some scaling factor b, you get back the original probability times that scaling factor to the gamma. So it's one of the only distributions that has that property. So that's why they're called scale-free. And in physics, we say scaling all the time when we see these power laws because of that. There's also a lot of other... Of the degree, yeah. Yep, so we're just thinking about degree right now. And there's a lot of interesting consequences of having a power law degree distribution. So if we think of it, power laws as probability distributions, if that exponent gamma is between 1 and 2, both the average and the standard deviation diverge. If it's between 2 and 3, the average is finite, but the standard deviation diverges. Once you get a sharp enough fall off, so gamma greater than 3, both things are finite. So this is another reason why they don't have scales, because we don't really know what the average is. And if we had a real system, as we collected data and then we went to a bigger size system, we would find that the average kept increasing. So it's not self-averaging. So there's a lot of interesting consequences of this. And one of the things about the standard deviation being diverging is that we end up with a fully connected network for most of the time. We build up a network, it tends to have a large connected component. And I'm going to talk to you a lot about connected components later on. So here's another disclaimer. Degree distribution is certainly not the whole story. There's many, many other attributes to this, which is why I don't let my students use that word scale-free, because all it tells us is that the degree distribution has a power law. And this is a nice diagram that I took from the Caltech group that they published in PNAS several years ago. And all these different networks have the same power law degree distribution. But you can see they have tremendously different properties. This guy's kind of random. This guy's very regular. So it's not the whole story, but it is a starting point. Actually, I don't think you can, right? Because here we have everything ordered sort of from highest degree to lowest degree. This guy is really much more random, so it has a bigger diameter, for sure, than this guy, which has diameter 1. Yeah, so there are definitely different structural properties to it.
Right, that the way it appears to us has a lot
Yeah,
to do with the visualization.
absolutely.
How they've embedded the diameters.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, see, and also if we look at, I love it, it's good. And also if we look at sort of the clustering, so how interconnected are the things? Like here we have a lot of interconnectivity. In this guy, it's a tree. So there's definitely many different features that aren't captured by just degree distribution. So it is a starting point, though, and a lot of people started thinking about how to generate power law degree distributions, so like growth mechanisms and networks that would yield power law degree distributions. And that'll be the first part of my talk. So some of the known mechanisms for generating power laws are phase transitions, which is sort of why physicists sort of got excited about this, because whenever we see things going through interesting phase transitions, they happen to have these scaling properties. So we see a lot of response functions that have power laws. Second order phase transitions, which I'll talk about again too. And things like fragmentation, so like asteroids colliding. But one of the mechanisms that's been most popular for generating power laws is something called preferential attachment or proportional attachment, which is that popularity is attractive. So what it says is that the rate of growth is proportional to your current size. So if there was just one thing going through this, it would be exponential growth and uninteresting. But we're going to start out with a collection of things that have random size, and we let them follow this growth process, and we'll find that the big things get amplified and grow faster, and the small things don't grow as much. And asymptotically, we'll end up with a power law degree distribution, or power law distribution in sizes. So if I looked at the distribution of sizes, the asymptotic result would be a power law. So Polya introduced this in the 1920s. He was interested in models of balls falling into urns. So he thought the probability of occupying the urn was proportional to how many balls were there. Yule then expanded this to look at genetic diversity in plants, sort of thinking about how genes flow between species. And Ziff started popularizing it much more when he looked at the distribution of city sizes. So he plotted how many cities have a particular size, and he found that the distribution of cities followed a power law with exponent -1. So it was a nice observation. And then Simon really popularized the idea in the 1950s. So he was interested in looking at distribution of wealth in economies, and he coined this term, the rich get richer. So if we all took the amount of money that we had and put it in the bank and we're getting the same rate of return on investment, we would be following this rule and we'd see some power law distribution after many, many years. And Pareto actually played a big role in this too. So Pareto did some early observations of land ownership in Italy, and he found that 20% of the population owned 80% of the land. So these distributions in statistics, power law distributions, are often called Pareto distributions, and you'll often hear this 80-20 principle, especially if you work in a product group at Microsoft. So that's the idea of preferential attachment, and people then applied it to networks. So this is the history of preferential attachment in networks. And there was a very interesting guy, Derek Della Sola Price, and he was a physicist who became an information scientist. So he spent a lot of time in the stacks in the library, and he started looking at citation networks amongst papers. So he wanted to look at how many citations papers received, and he looked at the distribution of citations, and he found that they obeyed a power law. So he published this observation in Science in 1965. 10 years later, approximately, he came up with a generative model. So his model was that the rate that a paper gains citations is proportional to how many it already has. So I'm more likely to come across a paper that's been cited more, and it's proportional to how many cites it has. So he came up with a model of network growth of citation networks. And it wasn't so popular. It appeared in a more obscure journal, and people really lost knowledge about it. It didn't ever gain traction. And then in 1999, Barabashi and Albert published a now incredibly influential paper where they basically thought of the same idea, but in a broader context. It wasn't just citation networks, it was networks in general. So they were saying the probability of gaining a new edge is proportional to how many edges I have. And they made this model, and I think it's a lovely example of preferential attachment itself. So this is from Google Scholar, looking at how many citations it had in 2006, 2007, 2008, and 2009. So
does this mean that the popular practice of evaluating how good somebody is by how many citations their papers get is not sound? Or
so we should probably normalize that for thinking about it being a power law instead of assuming that it's a Gaussian distribution.
Nobody does.
They don't, no. And you know, there's so much we could do with that. We could use page ranking algorithms to look at how influential things are. So.
This still doesn't contradict the possibility that a more cited paper is a better one. It's simply a question of how do you take two papers written by me, one which is highly cited and one which is lowly cited. Someone else has written two medium level papers. How do you compare these two?
Okay. Yeah, let's talk. We'll talk about how to evaluate scientists after you guys decide to evaluate me. Okay, so this is the model of
Yesterday there was a note circulating among all the MSR lab directors about the fact that Sweden came out #1 in number of citations per paper or something like that. Sweden, the USA, came out #2 or something. And then people were coming up with all of the, what?
Sweden the country or Sweden the Microsoft lab?
Sweden the country. Higher than the U.S. And anyway, and then people started coming. I mean, Rick Rashid came up with like the number of horses per citation because he owns horses, and we thought of lots of different metrics that one could use in evaluating research.
which is a field in itself.
Yes.
Okay, so back to preferential attachment. So this has been a model that people have used a lot to think about mechanisms for network growth. But a few years ago, in 2002, there was a really nice paper by 3 computer scientists.
I have a question that's a little bit more philosophical. So if you're taking this distribution, which is the number of citations you have or the number of edges you have, and it's clearly not a number. You're taking numbers that are very, very different orders of magnitude. There are numbers that are 1, there are numbers that are 100. So clearly you're not going to get a Gaussian distribution for that because you cannot get a Gaussian distribution, are you? So is in some sense saying that it's a power law, we should be saying that it's not something?
That would probably be more accurate because going back a few slides, when I first put those broad-scale degree distributions, none of them were power laws. They all saturated at the end. And they're finite data sets. How do we know if it's log normal, stretched exponential? And there's been a lot of research in the last couple, 2-3 years of trying to evaluate in finite data which is the best fit to the model. So it's true. We should just think about these as broad scale.
So the fact that it's a fat tail distribution is somewhat trivial, right? Or no? It's not.
You know, yeah. And we're going to talk about Erdos-Renyi a little bit later, which is such a well-known model of network growth that doesn't yield these kinds of distributions at all. So, you know, and there's a lot of interesting, funny anecdotes. Like people say, power laws are the signature of people looking for power laws. But there's this nice model by these 3 computer scientists, and they said, why would I ever connect to something that's already heavily loaded? So they were thinking more in the context of routers connecting to the internet. So you have some backbone, a new net router arrives. Why would it look for the globally most connected router and connect in there, which you would assume would give it worse performance? So they thought about a local optimization model. So they wanted to think about nodes arriving sequentially in the unit square, and they started out with a single seed node. So Jennifer knows this work, so bear with me for 10 minutes, and then we'll get to new stuff. So we start out with a central node, and new nodes arrive, and they're going to connect to whatever node optimizes a local cost function for them. And they're going to look at a trade-off between 2 metrics. So node I arrives, and it's going to connect to node j that minimizes this function, where d sub ij is the Euclidean distance, and h sub j is a network distance. It's the hop count of node j to the root node. So this guy is hop count 1. This guy is hop count 2. So you want to connect to whoever is going to give you the best performance of this trade-off. And you can see, like, if I made alpha equal to 0, everybody would connect to the lowest hop count, and we'd make a star. If I made alpha equal to infinity, everybody would connect to the guy closest to them in space. So we can tune alpha. Yep, so we're thinking about the unit square, and the node arrives somewhere at random in the unit square. So it's going to have some xy coordinate position, uniformly at random, and it's going to connect to whoever minimizes that trade-off between the two. Hj is the hop count from the central node. So it's a measure of network centrality, and this is a measure of Euclidean distance. So it's a beautiful model, but it didn't exactly...
So if you connect to someone with Hj, it means that you can reach everybody with Hj plus 1.
Yes. Yep, exactly. Not exactly. It means that you would be that far from the center, but the center can't reach everybody in one hop count. It's just more likely to have a short path to most nodes. It's a tree. It just is probably my drawing program, because everyone only connects to one parent. So, and we can think about how to make it non-trees, but this is a tree for now. And it's a nice model, but it doesn't exactly yield the distributions that we see in these broad-scale degree distributions. Instead, the first 1 over alpha nodes sort of conquer different territories, and then all the incoming nodes condense around them. So you can kind of see that happening, that there's some local hubs that are forming. So instead of a broad-scale degree distribution, you get something more bimodal. So with Jennifer and Christian and Noam Berger and Bobby Kleinberg, we started thinking about how to modify this process in order to make it a metric that didn't have a scale in it. So if you look here, alpha is a scaling factor, right? It has units of 1 over distance. So we wanted to come up with a formulation that wouldn't have a scale in it. And we wanted to look at linear trade-offs with the scale-free metric. And what we thought was that we would generate some kind of broad-scale degree distributions like power laws. Give me a second. But what we ended up doing is we came up with a local optimization model that gives rise to the mechanism of preferential attachment, which in turn gives rise to the power law degree distributions. And we see a couple other interesting features. They had a claim that wasn't correct. So it appeared in iCalp in 2002, and they had proof that didn't actually hold up to scrutiny. And they claimed that it was going to make power law degree distributions, but it didn't. It makes this bimodal structure. And when we first started working on it, the first thing I did was just simulate it because it was so easy, and I looked at the probability distribution function, and it went boom. And these guys, there's a lot of debate about how to fit power laws, which seems a little specious because they're just broad scale. It doesn't really matter so much about what exact form it is. But there's a lot of discussion. Do you use the PDF or the cumulative distribution function? What's that? Yeah, exactly. But the CDF hides a lot of small features, and these guys just looked at the CDF. So that was part of it. You had a question, Sharon? Scale-free would mean that there's no scale. So this has units. It has units of 1 over distance. And the metric, the cost function, doesn't have a scale in it. It's just a number. So that means that this is a distance, so alpha has to have units of 1 over distance. So that's what I meant by a scale, that there's some kind of intrinsic measure in there, and the scale ends up partitioning the space into units of 1 over alpha squared. So we wanted to modify this, and we thought we could come up with a way of really getting power law degree distributions. And we got this much more interesting thing that instead of going direct from an optimization model to power laws, we went from an optimization model to showing that preferential attachment could actually arise from underlying optimization. So I'm going to walk you through the model really quickly. So we can't even do a square. We can only do a line. And it's the same idea. We start with a central node at 0, and we're going to look at nodes arriving at some random point along the line. And we're going to now minimize this function. And instead of having alpha be a constant, it's going to be a function of what's happening between t, the node that's arrived, and j, the potential parent. And the simplest thing we could think of for making this a function is we're going to make it proportional to the local density between nodes t and j. So it's going to be more expensive to connect in a dense region than in a sparse region. So our function is now going to be some constant times the density, and density is the number divided by the distance. So now when I plug it into this function, I see that the distance goes away, and all I'm left with is some constant times the number of nodes intervening in the interval between nodes t and j, plus the hop count of node j. So that's my new cost function. And like I said, it's proportional to the local density. It reduces to the number of points in the interval between t and j, and we feel that it captures some aspects at a toy model level of internet routing, because there you have to pay every time that you transit package between domains. So we're trying to minimize the number of transit intervals until you reach someone with good network centrality. So it's a toy model. Okay, so here's just an example of the process. So we start out with a single node. This guy arrives, no choice. Node 2, So NTJ is how many nodes are between you and the potential parent. And HJ is what's the hop count of your potential parent from the root.
It's the hop count.
Yep. Okay, so like this guy, node 3 arrives, and it could connect to 0, but it has to pay 1 unit for the intervening node, and it pays 0 for the hop count of node 0. Node 3 could connect to node 2. It pays nothing for the interval, but it pays 1 for the hop count of node 2. And they're counted in units of alpha. So for the intervening nodes, and the hop count is just in units. Yep. So this is just an illustration. The minimum. So you connect to whoever minimizes that function. You connect to j, so node t arrives, it connects to node j, that minimizes that function. Where the point arrives, exactly. So these are just some examples of the process. And you'll see that it ends up being a local model. So I end up connecting either to whoever's closest to me in space or to the parent of that node because of the way that the trade-off is constructed. So I have either, once this guy has a lot of intervening nodes in the interval between it and the guy with the hop count -1, it ends up being cheaper to connect to this guy. So I end up either connecting to my neighbor or to the parent of my neighbor. So it's local in that sense. What's that? No. And this is the process on a line, and we're going to think about it on a tree in just a minute. So,
What do you mean by end up?
I'm sorry, end up?
I end up connecting.
So I will connect. So the thing that the node j that minimizes this function will either be the node who is my neighbor, so I pay nothing for the hop count, or nothing for the number of nodes intervening in the interval because it's my neighbor, so there's 0 nodes between me and it. Or else I connect to its parent, because its parent has hop count 1 minus the node here. So I have 2 choices of who will minimize the cost function. It's either the node next to me on the interval or the parent of that node.
And it doesn't make a difference what the value of alpha is?
It makes a difference eventually. So you'll see that node 1 was empty, and then it got colored red. So what happens is once your parent gets 1 over alpha children, it saturates. and it's no longer going to gain the new attachment. The rightmost child gains the attachment. So initially, the lowest hop count node is incredibly attractive, but after it has enough children, that saturates, and its child becomes fertile. So that's what we...
Christian has a nice description of this in terms of thesis advisors. So he says, you know, you look around when you're a student for a thesis advisor, the person who has the most students, you assume, oh, that person must be a really good thesis advisor, so you connect to them. At a certain point, they have so many students that they're no longer attractive, they're kind of saturated, and then you go on.
He had a
extreme example of that.
he also he had another thing too, because he said, like, the first few students who you train aren't very good because you don't know what you're doing yet. And then after you've trained enough students, they become fertile and capable of training others. Okay, so once the guy with lowest hop count gains enough intervening nodes in the interval, its rightmost child becomes attractive and fertile. So that's this concept of fertility. And what we wanted to do was to go from the line to the tree. So what we're going to do is integrate out the spatial dependence. So what we want to care about is what's the probability that the node that arrives at t time plus 1 falls into the kth interval. And what we care about is the ordering of the nodes. So pi of t is just the ordering, 0, 2, 1, 0, 2, 3, 1. So all we care about is we want to know, sorry, wrong way. We want to know the probability that it falls into the kth interval given the permutation. So the real probability depends on the permutation and the length of all the intervals, but we're going to integrate out the length of the intervals. So we end up finding that the probability of landing in any interval is just uniform over all intervals. So we got rid of the spatial aspect of it. So this is how we end up getting preferential attachment. So you probably see this by now since we've talked about it a little bit. So when a node starts gaining children, each new child contributes a new interval, and each interval is proportional to its attractiveness. So initially, the node starts getting more and more attractive the more children it has, because each interval contributes to its attractiveness, but eventually it's going to saturate and its rightmost child becomes attractive. So we have preferential attachment that saturates. So the probability of node at t plus 1 connecting to node j initially is proportional to the degree of j, but once that degree is 1 over alpha, which I've renormalized as a, just recalled a, I end up connecting to the minimum of the number of children it has, its interval, or its saturation point A. So I get preferential attachment with saturation. Normal preferential attachment would just have you connecting proportional to degree. It would never saturate. So with this model, we showed that you can get this kind of preferential attachment that eventually saturates. And we looked at a rigorous analysis of the degree sequence. So exactly, yeah. So yeah, is 1 over alpha. So if you never saturate, you would just see preferential attachment forever. What's that? Saturation means that the new intervals, your new children, don't contribute to your attractiveness anymore. So we could have two limits. So if I made alpha 0, so if I make A 0, or in other words, alpha infinite, that means that I never saturate, and I keep gaining preferential attachment. And the other rate, if I made alpha equal to 1, that means it's random attachment, because it would just be connecting to 1 over t plus 1 at that point. So we did a rigorous analysis of the process on the degree sequence. So we said let n sub 0 at t be the number of infertile nodes, n sub k at t is the number of fertile nodes of degree k that haven't yet saturated, and n sub a of t is the number that have saturated. And we can look at the process and show that the probability of observing a node of degree k goes as a power law for nodes that haven't yet saturated, and then it decays exponentially for nodes that have saturated. And these are the kinds of distributions that I showed you initially, those power laws with exponential tails, and these are seen really ubiquitously in lots of empirical measurements. So in biological systems, in earthquake magnitudes, in physical systems, and in citation networks of papers. So power laws with exponential tails are seen pretty commonly. So that was a nice question. We actually were lucky, and our picture was pretty, and they chose it for the cover of PNAS. And we had several questions that we haven't, yeah?
Is there a finite, so if you're estimating just a power law with a finite sample size, wouldn't you also expect some sort of tail decay if you see
You could, yeah, and it's so personally, the one place that I've seen real power laws is looking at web search logs. So there's just so many searches that, so it was a couple of years ago, it was probably like 3-4 years ago the last time I looked, and so Britney Spears was still #1. And then if you look at the probability, the frequency with which terms are queried, that really followed a beautiful power law. So once you have enough elements, you can get pure power laws, but once you have finite numbers of things, you can't. And who knows if their power laws are log normal. And there's 3 people who just wrote a really nice review that's all about using maximum likelihood estimation to determine which is the best fit model. So it was Cosmo Shalizi, Aaron Closet, and Mark Newman, and it's coming out in SIAM Review in a couple of months. So we had several open questions out of this work. So I showed you something that was optimizing a geometric metric and a tree metric. So we were interested in seeing if there's other things that might optimize trade-offs. So something that's interesting that we haven't looked at is thinking about biological systems. And here I also have been studying open source software. And there's some trade-off between modularity and efficiency. So modularity is great. Modules can break, the system can still function. It makes things much more robust to kinds of failures, but it also makes it less efficient the more modules you have to evoke at runtime. We were also interested in things like economics, so I'd probably be willing to give up some value in order to trade with someone I trust more. So several things that we were interested in. One of the huge outstanding issues in the field in general is how do you validate any of these network growth models? So one of the things would be like looking at how many functions are invoked in each module versus how many modules have to be invoked in order to get a particular action of the system accomplished. So like in open source software, if you wanted to say you had the Apache. So it would be, this would be looking at how many modules you'd have to invoke. So it would be alpha times the number of modules. And then this would be looking at probably like size of modules, something like that. But it's something that we haven't really explored very carefully.
What about phase transitions?
That's what we're about to get to.
In a sense, something like this seems generic, right? Because you're basically saying things are like preferential attachment until some capacity constraint is hit.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
kills it. So is there a kind of more general notion in which it's generic? I mean, it seems like any process.
It is, and what you just said is exactly what people more in the engineering world have been interested in. So looking at airport capacity, where does the power loss stop? Sort of tells you where are the fundamental constraints in a system and where you might want to be putting more gates at an airport or more airports in a region. So definitely where it turns over tells you something about the fundamental constraints in the system. And if you had an unconstrained system, you could make a power law. But if resources are finite, you'll never get a power law. And so validation is really an outstanding issue in the field in general of trying to understand network growth models that might fit real-world systems. And Michael Mitzenmacher has written some nice editorials about this in Internet Math, about how we need validation, but not a lot of ideas exactly about yet how to validate them. And moving beyond degree distribution. So everything I've shown you is just degree distribution. And as I started, degree distribution is certainly not the whole story. So before preferential attachment, there were a lot of models of network growth, and this is where I'm trying to move towards phase transitions, and I needed a segue slide, so I just kind of threw this up there for lack of anything better. But we might think about nodes already being there. So we might think about everybody on the planet who's alive at this instant, and there are nodes, and we might want to think about how we would connect them up with a communication system. So we want to take all the nodes that are already there, and we want to add edges down at random. And that process of the nodes already being there and adding edges is also really different than having nodes and edges arrive at random. So there's some nice, this was a really nice paper that I will point you to if you're interested in. So the idea of thinking about networks really started out in the late 1950s. So with this thought of having the edges, the nodes already there, so we start with n edges, and we want to, n nodes, and we want to think about adding edges at random between pairs of nodes. So this was ideas that were thought about by Erdos-Renyi, which are very well known for it. But at the same time, Ed Gilbert, who is a mathematician at Bell Labs, was thinking of similar ideas, and he was interested in cellular communication. So 1959, he was interested in trying to think about how to build base stations and connect people up to cell towers. So another person whose work was way ahead of his time. So let's say that we start with n isolated vertices, and I'm going to add edges one at a time at random. The maximum number of edges is the number of nodes. Each node can connect to every other node, so I get n times n minus 1, and I'm thinking about undirected edges, so I'm dividing by a factor of 2. Okay, and now I'm going to think of this, it's a random process, so I'm going to add some edges. So after I've added script E edges, the probability of any edge being there is the number I've divided by the total number that could be there. And I want to know, what does the resulting graph look like? So what is the typical member of the ensemble for some probability P? And here I've just drawn some pictures. So I said n equals 300 vertices, and the probability is small, 1 over 400. Here the probability is also small, just slightly larger. And what I did is I colored in red the size of the largest cluster of connected nodes, so the nodes that you can reach by traversing a path along edges. So the largest such cluster I colored in red in both sides. And you can see here it's really tiny. It's like 8 nodes. And over here it spans the whole system. So something happened as I raised that probability slightly. And it was a phase transition. So this is called the emergence of the giant component. So it happens at a critical probability, PC, which is equal to 1 over n. So here I was below 1 over n. Here I'm above 1 over n. So the critical probability is at 1 over n. And if p is less than PC, the largest connected component scales as log of n. If p is greater than PC, the largest connected component scales linearly in n. So here's just a picture of what the process looks like. So I start adding edges, and this is looking at the size, the fraction of nodes in the largest component. And I see initially it's tiny, and then I reach the phase transition point, and my largest component gains mass. And normally we want to average it, normalize it, so we get rid of the dependence on n. So if I look at the average node degree, it's the probability of throwing down an edge times the number of nodes. So I find that that happens when the average node degree is 1, so it looks like a tree. So it's a branching process. And most analysis assumes that these things are branching processes at the critical point, and that's how you're able to find values of it. So phase transitions are very studied extensively. They're really the bane of modern condensed matter physics and statistical physics. And what is it? It's an abrupt change in a fundamental property of a system in response to a slim change in an external control parameter. A branching process is a tree. It's a random tree. So you might also think about it like starting from a node. How many neighbors will I have? Then I go to those neighbors. How many neighbors will they have, et cetera? And I'm assuming that there's no loops. So as a function of time, it was actually thought of. So Galton was interested in looking at the extinction of surnames. So he was looking at like aristocratic surnames in England. And he wanted to predict if these names would ever go away or not. So he was looking at the probability of having male children. And will you have more? So he was interested in understanding whether so you can imagine, like in this branching process over time, if I have more than one neighbor, then I will continue going towards infinity. If I have less than one neighbor, it's going to terminate. So phase transition, so here's one. I showed you the giant connected component. And after the giant connected component exists, we can also think about percolation happening on that component. So we can think about spreading processes like epidemics, stuff like that. And in physics, we're more interested in materials. So we study a lot about spin systems or Boolean variables, so things can have plus or minus values. And we're interested in understanding the net, whether spins align with each other or not, as a function of the temperature in the system. So this is sort of the quintessential phase transition. I think about spins, and they have some probability of aligning with neighbors, which minimizes their energy, but there's also temperature, which randomizes things. And as I start lowering the temperature, initially it's high temperature, so everything's disordered. As I get to a critical temperature, there ends up being spontaneous magnetization, and I see that I can like make a magnet out of something. And one of the things that's very intriguing is that a lot of systems show universality. And this is actually Sal Torquato had a nice picture last week where he showed a phase diagram, solid, liquid, gas of a typical material. And almost all materials we know have very similar phase diagrams. So why is that? We don't really know. They have some little deviations here and there, but overall they have very similar liquid, solid, gas phase transitions. So this is a puzzle of why there's so much universality. Some are, yeah. But this is certainly one of the things that people think a lot about is what characterizes this phase transition and what other systems have similar phase transition properties. So we want to think about the class of systems that have the same kinds of phase transition properties. And hopefully if we understand one, we'll understand aspects about the rest. I'm going to get to that in a second. Okay, so this is a second order phase transition. So it's a continuous phase transition. And there's like terminology that's kind of antiquated because people were looking at whether first derivatives or second derivatives were discontinuous. But basically, we want to know whether phase transitions are continuous or discontinuous. Continuous ones tend to have a lot of interesting properties that discontinuous ones don't. So the Erdos-Renyi is a continuous phase transition. So I'm showing you this from numerical results because I'm going to show you a more interesting process in a minute that we can only analyze numerically. So this is known rigorously, but I want to show it to you so that you have a baseline for thinking about the new process. So we know that for Erdos-Renyi, if you're just below the critical value, so Tc minus epsilon, the largest component scales as n to the 2/3. When you're just above it, it scales as n to 2/3 plus a little bit. And that little bit gets smaller and smaller with system sizes n to the minus 1/3. So here I'm showing you the little bit decays as my number of nodes n increases. So I get a continuous transition that Tc minus epsilon and Tc plus epsilon, the difference between them goes to 0. So that's how it's continuous. I haven't said anything different yet.
That was log n.
Below Tc, you have only log n. At Tc, you get n to the 2/3.
The scaling here is different. Before, you were looking at things that were divided by n. Now you're looking at lower order effects.
That's right.
Things
That's right.
Scaling like n to
Yeah.
the 2/3, which, if you divide it by n, would just be 0.
And Jennifer is an expert. She did a lot of seminal work on this. Okay, so these are thinking about finite systems, right? So n is a finite number. So what we want to understand is what happens in that critical window. So we know that when we're well below the critical window, the largest component is going to be log n. And when we're above the critical window, it's going to be a times n. In the critical window, we have to do a lot of analysis because it's a finite system. So we try and come up with finite size scaling properties. And this is a result of finite size scaling, shows us that the discontinuity decays as n to the minus 1/3.
So what you typically see is this stuff divided by n. So what you see is that the density of the largest cluster, log n over n, the density of the largest cluster is 0. Or above the phase transition, a times n over n, the density of the largest cluster is a, positive density. Now, what happens when you go right to the critical point itself, or right inside this little critical window? How is it going from 0 to non-zero? How is it going from log to n? What's happening when you get very, very close to the critical point?
What is Cmax? Is the number of nodes?
It's the fraction. So here, actually, it's the number of nodes in the largest component.
And epsilon, it doesn't matter what it is?
So epsilon matters. Epsilon matters, and let's see. I have a next slide where I show you. I used epsilon, the value of it, as 0.0005. Okay, and Tc is also a random variable, right? Because I'm looking at a numerical process. So where Tc occurs for a particular realization is a random variable. And I'm going to take that realization, and it's Tc, and subtract off 1 or 2 edges, and then I'm going to add on 1 or 2 edges.
But you should think of epsilon as kind of scaling,
So
going to 0 when n.
But here epsilon is such that you add 1 or 2 edges to the entire graph.
Correct.
And that causes on average less than 1 node of difference in terms of the size of the joint component.
Yeah, and really what we need to think about is the scaling of epsilon. So we should think about epsilon being proportional to n.
Is it just saying that most likely when you throw in an edge, you'll attach? So to attach a new node, you need one of the endpoints to be inside and the other on the outside, which is exactly this probability.
You have to ask, how does epsilon scale with n? It's going to 0 with n. For this to be, for this to have this behavior. If epsilon were strictly positive, were uniformly positive, then you would have 0 log n and n. Okay, so epsilon is scaling like, I think, like n to the minus 1/3. And if epsilon is scaling like n to the minus 1/3, then inside, because the question is, what does close enough mean? What does inside that window mean? If I took n to the minus 1/2, the window would be
You're taking
way
n
too
to be
small.
1 over n right now?
I'm taking it to be proportional to 1 over n. So it's some number of edges divided by n.
n to the minus 1/3.
I think it is n to the minus 1/3. Yeah.
I think the reason confusion is coming up is because A should be measured as a function of epsilon,
Yes.
and we don't know.
Uh-huh,
There's no
uh-huh.
epsilon on the right-hand side.
Okay.
Yes.
Yep. Yep. And again, so this is there's like textbooks written about how to do these analyses, and this thing that I'm showing you is actually who's visiting, who's
Working on this, that's if you're interested. Is working on generalizations of or the variance of the some harder models and more subtle.
Sharon has a question.
So what is the relevance of what happens exactly here? What are the implications of?
Well, let me move forward, and maybe we'll understand. Okay, so this is a
So here you're studying the intermediate regime between log n and n.
correct.
What
And
about the intermediate regime between log n and n to the 2/3? I mean,
What happens is, and it's kind of
this just
weird,
seems
but-
very arbitrary.
No, it's not arbitrary. It turns out that n to the minus 1/3 is the right scale. If you looked at a scale like n to the minus 1/2, it would be behaving the same way. If you looked at a scale like n to the minus 1/5, nothing interesting would be happening. It would still be like log n.
could you be outside the
Log
scaling
n
window?
with some slight power law modifications. So what the right width of this window is actually at which non-trivial things start happening is one of the things you have to determine. And then throughout that window, it's acting like n to the 2/3. But if I picked the wrong scaling of the window, it would basically be looking like log n and up to relatively small modifications. So n to the minus 1 over, 2 beta plus gamma, or gamma plus 2, that 3 is actually related to some of the critical exponents of the physics problem. And that 2/3 is also related to some of the critical exponents of the physics problem. You have to get that exactly right. If you don't, you miss this behavior. You're either inside it or outside it.
Okay, I understand. I'm willing to buy the stuff about the width of the window being n to the minus 1/3, but I still don't understand. What about the transition between the log n behavior and the n to the 2/3 behavior?
Not very interesting, it turns
Why
out.
not?
You can do it. Those are lower order effects, and it is you can do them, but they are corrections. It turns out they're lower order terms. Not obvious in advance, but it turns out. And it's not at all obvious. Okay.
And you've written maybe 30 or 40 papers about finite size scaling in different processes.
I've written some papers on
Yeah.
finite size scaling in different systems, and you're
Yeah.
right. It's actually a very interesting area. And a priori, you would just say, oh, what's the difference? Well, it turns out that is really special, and that's where the action is happening. If you try to do something else, you're going to find it's a lower order effect.
And-
what's this got to do with physics? In physics, isn't n equal to 10 to the 23rd?
First of all, there are truly finite systems, okay, which you actually study in labs, and then you begin to see this. And second, the most interesting things in physics are happening at this point. So you want to know how close you can get to this point. And then finite size effects actually start to come into play. And if you look at the analog in computer science and like the satisfiability problem, it is within the analogous window that you find the hardest instances of problems and stuff. So you have to nail. So although in parameter space, this is a very, it's gone. It's just one point. You want to get into that because that is where the most interesting instances are found. Okay, so there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there. And so you try, and then there's something else called self-organized criticality, in which dynamical processes can drive you towards the phase transition. So there are dynamical processes in nature which drive you towards the phase transition.
So that's our primer on finite size scaling. Is this reasonable? Okay, and I agree with that there should be an epsilon there. And so this was measured from a numerical experiment trying to show that the constant a goes as n to the minus 1/3, which is the result that we know that that's how it should scale. Okay, so when I look at an infinite size system, I would find that the difference below and above the transition window goes to 0. So now I want to ask you, is connectivity a good thing? Do we want to have connected components? And that's certainly a context-dependent question, right? So if I'm building a communication system, transportation, I want things to synchronize, I need there to be a connected component. On the other hand, if I'm trying to fight viruses, computer or human viruses, I want to make sure I'm operating below the critical window. So above the critical window, definitely connected component. Below it, no connected component. So connectivity is certainly a relevant, a context-dependent thing. So we wanted to ask, is there a limited perturbation that we can do to this Erdos-Renyi graph generation process that will let us change the location of the phase transition? So can we enhance it or delay it? And Tom Bowman and Alan Fries have done some work on this. And I'm going to tell you about work that I did with Dimitris Akliopoulos and Joel Spencer that appeared this year, but in full disclosure, we started it in 2004 or 2005 when we were all at Microsoft, and we sort of worked on it a little bit on the side and finally managed to sit down and get some real results. So what we're going to think about is we know we can sample edges, right? So I have this edge sampling process. So instead of sampling an edge and adding it to the graph, I'm now going to sample 2 edges. I'm going to look at the property of what would happen if I add either edge, and I'm going to select which one I want to add. So I'm going to use this power of 2 choices, essentially. So what I'm going to do is I get now 2 edges each time step, and I'm going to decide, I'm going to have a criteria, selection criteria specified in advance, and decide which one to add to the edge, to the graph, and I'm going to discard the other. So if I want to enhance it, I would choose, here are my 2 sample edges, and let's say that these are schematics of the components at the end of those edges. If I want to enhance it, I would choose the edge that results in the largest component forming. If I want to delay it, I would choose the smallest component forming. And we looked at something called the product rule, where we're going to look at the product of the sizes of the components that would be merged by these edges. So here's 2 sample edges, E1 and E2. The product of the first one would be 7 times 2, 14. The product of the second one would be 4 times 4, 16. So if I want to enhance it, I would choose this guy. If I want to delay it, I would choose that guy. So that's my process. I'm going to decide in advance whether I'm enhancing or delaying, and I'm going to select this by the product rule.
And are you going to tell us why the product is a good thing?
There are many other rules that do the same thing. So the sum does the same thing as well.
So basically, you're trying to minimize the number of connected pairs.
We might want to enhance it or minimize it.
The quantity that you're optimizing over is the overall number of connected pairs.
Yeah, so we're going to look at the mass. We're looking at the mass of this component times the mass of that component. So the product of the sizes of the 2 components. And if we want to enhance it, we choose the one that maximizes that product. If we want to delay it, we choose the one that minimizes that product.
But the underlying random process is the total number of connected pairs.
So what I'm doing, the random process is adding edges. What I'm going to measure about the random process is the size of the largest connected component. So when I choose this and I want to enhance it, so the black line is my original Erdos-Renyi with the critical value average connectivity of 1. If I want to enhance it, I get a very similar process, but it happens earlier. But it's much more interesting if I choose to delay it. So if I delay it, you can see that it goes very abruptly. It's a very spontaneous, abrupt and dramatic process. And we wanted to understand in that same scaling window that we just looked at the Erdos-Renyi process, what happens here, because it certainly looks like a very violent and abrupt process. So now we're going to get to something called a discontinuous phase transition. So I showed you about continuous phase transitions, which are called second order, and now we're going to look at discontinuous transitions, which are also called first order. And what I want to show you is a similar argument, missing an epsilon, that at the size of the largest component, at the critical point minus epsilon goes as n to the gamma with gamma less than 1, so it's sublinear in n. And now when I go just slightly above it, so here I have a numerical value, so when I go slightly above it, I get that I have a system now that's linear times this constant a. And what I find is that as I go to larger and larger system sizes, a increases. So in Erdos-Renyi, a decreased with n to the minus 1/3. Here a is an increasing process. So as I go to a bigger and bigger system, the discontinuity between the 2 increases. So what I want to look at is how can we quantify this? So can we make it be as big as a half? So here I can I go from sublinear in n to something that has half of all the vertices.
I don't understand the vertical axis. You're Cmax over n on the other.
So this is the size of the giant component divided by the number of nodes. So it's the fraction of nodes that are in the giant component.
Are there other metrics that would make a difference?
Well, the property of the system that we're interested in is whether it has a giant component or not. What's the size of the largest component? Is it linear in system size or is it not? So this is the order parameter of interest, is the size of the giant component, or the fractional size of the giant component. Okay, so what we were looking at is we can only do this numerically. We are trying to come up with some rigorous analysis, but we haven't had much luck. I'll tell you about processes that you can have some luck with. But we're going to let T0 denote the last edge for which the giant component was less than square root of n, and let T1 denote the first edge for which the giant component has more than half of all the vertices. So it goes from square root of n to the majority of the vertices. And we're going to look at delta, which is the difference between these two. Okay, and if we look at a continuous transition, so Erdos-Renyi is the black. If we look at a continuous transition, we find that this delta scales as n. Here, for the product rule, we find that delta scales as n to the 2/3, so it's sublinear in n. So we can go from square root of n to the majority of vertices and the number of edges that scales sublinearly in n. And now we look at what is the typical parameterization, which is looking at the number of edges as the fraction of the number of nodes. So r times the number of nodes. Here I showed you absolute number of edges. And what we're more interested in is thinking about the ratio, so the number of edges as a function of n.
So are these plots averaged over here?
These are averaged, yes.
So I'm wondering, in this kind of transition period, is it somehow a high probability that it's behaving that way, or is it somehow the variance which is causing this?
Okay, so this is a good question, because if you look here, the location of the phase transition point is a random variable.
Right.
So I run an instance, and the value at which the transition happens is a random variable. And for these guys, it doesn't really matter. For this guy, the transition is so sharp that the variance in the location of the point is bigger than the window over which the thing is changing. So we couldn't just try and nail down the critical value by running a bunch of simulations and averaging them together, because the variance is too big. So we had to go towards bounding it with thinking about this kind of process where we look at the last edge below sublinear and the first edge above the majority. And so now we can do averaging. So each point here is the average over, I can't remember, a couple hundred realizations. And we look at it as system size increases. So we find that the window is sublinear in n. For the product rule, it's linear in n for the more traditional processes. And when we look at it in terms of this parameterization where the number of edges is some number r times the number of vertices n, what we find is that if r is less than rc, c max is square root of n. If r is greater than rc, c max is the majority of the vertices. And we can look at how these two approach one another. So this is looking at the value of rc from below the critical point as the system size increases. And this is looking at the value of RC from above as the system size increases. And we find that they approach each other. So doing independent fits from above and below, we find that they're converging to this value of 0.888. So it's our best estimate for the critical point for the product rule. And with this scaling, we find that we jump instantaneously from having half of all the vertices, square root of all the vertices, to having the majority of the vertices in time that's sublinear or essentially instantaneous. So we have a discontinuous transition. And one of the things that we were interested in is I showed you square root of n to half. Well, what can we, instead of choosing square root of n, what if we just make it gamma? So if we look at how long it takes to go from n to the gamma to half of all the vertices, it happens in n to the beta edges, which are both sublinear. So we find gamma and beta less than 1. And we find a scaling relationship. So we can look at a bunch of different values choices for gamma. And we find that for all those choices of gamma, gamma plus 1.2 beta equals 1.3. So we have a scaling relationship that holds for all values of A, which is this 0.5 here. But we find that we can make 0.5 anywhere between 0.1 and 0.6. So we should be able to jump instantaneously from having square root of n vertices to 60% of all the vertices in our giant component, which has a lot of consequences because beforehand it was a continuous transition. So if you wanted to really have a lot of people involved in that giant component, a lot of nodes, you had to add many, many more edges. And here we can delay when it happens, but we can incorporate everyone almost instantaneously.
So she said that the product rule didn't have to be enforced exactly like sound was.
Yeah, that's right.
Those identities remain the same, or the phenomenon?
They don't. We had hoped they would. So I tried the sum rule, and it gives you a different scaling behavior. And so this work actually appeared in Science in March of this year. And since it appeared, there's been several follow-up articles showing how this process relates to other kinds of graphs. So there are 3 letters that have just appeared in Physical Review letters. So the first was by Bob Ziff. And he sent me this article about 3 or 4 days after our work appeared in Science. He applied this to looking at percolation on a square lattice. And he showed that the same thing happened there, that if you use the 2 choices, that you get a discontinuous transition. And recently, there's 2 groups. So this is a Korean group, and these are people in Italy, who were applying this process to looking at broad-scale degree distribution. So the Erdos-Renyi is a Poisson distributed network. And these 2 groups looked at what happened if they applied this product rule to networks that have power law degree distributions. These guys looked at it using a model by Fan Chung and Luin Liu, where you start out with nodes having some weights, and you look at adding edges proportional to the weights between the 2 nodes. And what they found is very interesting. So if you remember when I started this conversation, I told you that if you have a power law and an exponent is less than 3, it's going to have a giant component. So there's no percolation threshold. It's got a giant component. And what they find is that you can now change that. So if you do this choice process, you won't have a giant component for anything less than 3. It pushes it back. So now you have to have a less sharp power law. So you have to have more large degree nodes. So you can push it back to 2.3 or 2.4, and it's also discontinuous. It became, yeah. So there's a lot of, I'll tell you the history of it. Okay, so Bowman and Fries published the first article on this, but it was Dimitri's idea. But it's really also the power of choice, right? That's right.
Conferences.
That Tom Bowman or, yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, some Dutch school or something that he just asked people about. He thought of this type of problem.
And then Bowman and Fries did their work in 2001, and Dimitris didn't publish anything about this. It was just a conjecture that a lot of people were interested in. So it became known as the Akliaptis process because of that. And we actually had discussion about whether we were going to call it an Akliaptis process in our paper or not, and we decided to do that. And so then this other group looked at a similar idea, but they looked at a configuration model, which I'm going to talk to you about in just a minute. And they found slightly different results. So they got the same thing, that you wouldn't have a giant component now until the exponent is smaller. They found 2.2. And they also found something interesting, because they found that it was still a continuous phase transition until you get to gamma greater than 3, and then it went to a discontinuous phase transition. So people have been looking at how these processes affect many other kinds of network growth. Okay, rigorous techniques, we don't know how to do it. So if you have a bounded size rule, you can analyze it rigorously. So what is a bounded size rule? I showed you these 2 components, and I'm taking the product of the components. If you take a bounded size rule, you treat all components of size greater than or equal to k as the same. So something is size k, 20k, 100k, you're going to just treat it as having size k. And if you do that, you can actually map the process onto differential equations and solve the critical threshold. And this was a nice article by Spencer and Wormald in Combinatorica called Birth Control for Giants. And so they showed that if it's a bounded size process, you can actually analyze it. Unbounded, we really don't know how to do it. Okay, so I'm going to skip this stuff because I want to get to things that are more interesting. But this was about scaling exponents of the process. And what is really interesting to me is how do we now move forward and think about networks that interact? So we know that there's these interdependencies. They're getting worse and worse. How can we understand consequences of interactions between networks? So here's a question. So I showed you Erdos-Renyi. We started out with n nodes, and we started adding edges. What if I just divide the nodes into 2 groups initially? So I say n over 2 of them are in group A, n over 2 of them are in group B. And I add blue edges between AA nodes at some rate, red edges between BB nodes at some rate, and green edges between the 2 groups at some rate. Does it change the process at all? And how does it change the process?
It's a little like this. There are A's and B's, and there are different attractions between the you know, the
Okay, I need to talk to you
the
about
Bs,
that. So
yeah.
that, yeah.
And it has, and we actually proved 10, 12 years ago that it has a first order phase.
This won't. This will still have a second order. And my question is it different than regular Erdos-Renyi? And I'm imagining that you're all thinking, well, yes, it must be, or else she wouldn't be showing me, right? So instead of analyzing this by Erdos-Renyi, which I'll show you in a few minutes because that we can do numerically, we can analyze it mathematically thinking about random graphs. So this is work with Elizabeth Light, who's a postdoc working with me for the last year. And we were looking at percolation on interacting networks. So we were thinking about having a network A, a network B. We actually did it for a system of L interacting networks. So our paper that's on the archive has this formalism worked out for L interacting networks. But I'm just going to show you two because it's complicated enough. And it's also got some nice consequences. So if I think about a particular edge, it's got some A edges and a particular node, it has some A edges and some B edges. So now my probability, instead of being that P of K I showed you, that was probability of observing a node with degree K, I have the probability for a node in network A to have Ka edges to network A and Kb edges to network B. So I get I get a set of probability distributions for the A network and for the B network. And we're going to analyze this using generating functions, which following the procedure outlined in Newman, Strogatz, and Watts in 2001. And what you can do with these generating functions is calculate the distribution in component sizes, which is ultimately what our interest is going to be. So we want to think about what are the component size distributions, when is it going to diverge, when are we going to get a giant connected component. So we're going to consider the ensemble of all networks that can be built consistent with these two probability distributions. So it's a configuration model. All we care about is that it's consistent with this, and we're going to think about properties of that. And I don't know if any of you have ever used generating functions very much. So when I learned how to use them was in statistical physics, where we care about distributions of collections of identical elements. So we care about a collection of molecules, what properties do they have, what is the distribution of them. So generating functions let us think about distributions. And this is the most basic generating function for a network mu, would just be summing over that probability distribution times some placeholder variables. Why we do that is that then we can take derivatives of this generating function and get the moments of the distribution. So I've shown you a very simple one here, where if I take the derivative with respect to B of this guy, where I decided to focus on network A. So if I take the derivative of this function with respect to the partial derivative with respect to x of b and evaluate it at xa equals 1 and xb equals 1, it brings down one of the kb terms. And I get, since I've set these equal to 1, I get the sum of kb times that probability distribution. So it's the average b degree of A nodes. So this is how we use generating functions. They let us calculate moments of distributions pretty simply. And we can build on this and look at more complicated properties. So I have 3 slides. They're a little bit complicated, technical, algebraic. But what we're first going to think about is the connectivity at the end of a random edge. So I'm going to think about following a random AB edge to an A node. So the number of such edges is just proportional to the B degree of that A node. So that A node has KB edges, so the probability, if I've chosen edge at random, the probability that I land at an A node with degree KB is proportional to those number of edges. So this is the probability of following an AB edge to a node with degree A, with B degree KB is proportional to its B degree. And I'm going to look at the generating function of this distribution. So I looked at the same procedure, and now I can substitute in the probability, and I find this value, that it's the partial derivative with respect to B of this function divided by the average value of the B connectivity for a node in network A. Okay? Now I'm going to iterate this edge following process. So I'm going to think about how to move forward, and I want to think about the generating function for the component connected to that node at the end of that random edge. So I chose a random edge, and I landed on a node, and I want to think of all possible ways that that node can be connected throughout the network. So it might be an isolated node. It might be a node that has one edge to another node that we then have to iterate on and figure out what its component is. It might be a node that has one A edge, one B edge, might have 2 A edges, might have 2 B edges. So what we do is we write out all of the possibilities times their probabilities. So this is the probability of being an isolated node, of having an A edge, no B edges, no A edges, 1 B edge, et cetera. So we write this out, and luckily we can see that it has the same form as that random edge following generating function. So I can write this thing compactly as the the generating function that calculates the distributions of component sizes at the end of a random edge can be written in terms of this edge following generating function. There's one final step. So I showed you what happens about the component at the end of a random edge. And now I want to think about a random node. So I'm going to choose a node at random, and it has one of those components at the end of each edge. So I want to say that if it has Ka edges to network A, Kb edges to network B, and at the end of each edge, I have to think about one of those distributions being there. So how we deal with generating functions, so we want to look at the components at the end of an AA edge, and we have to sum it over all K edges, all Ka edges incident to that A node, which ends up multiplying. So you raise the generating function to some power. So the probability of choosing a random A node and looking at its component size is the probability of having an A node, and then we sum over all the possible kinds of connectivity that an A node can have and look at the size of the component on the A edges and the size of the component on the B edges. And now we can finally get to something interesting. So this is looking at the expected component of a random edge, and we can start looking at expectation values. So up until now, this math has been exact, but what I'm going to do is look at expected values, and I'm not going to tell you anything about concentration. So I can't prove anything with this, but I can calculate an expectation, what things are. So what I can calculate here is the expected number of A nodes in the component of a randomly chosen A node, and it's the partial derivative of this guy with respect to xa, evaluated at xa equals xb equals 1. Okay, and finally now we're going to plug in actual forms for these distributions. So what I showed you for arbitrary degree distributions, they didn't have any forms yet. And I'm going to look at what happens for two interacting Poisson networks. So first I'm just going to say let them be independent. So the probabilities of the A's and the B's are independent of each other. And now I'm going to assume that all the distributions are Poisson. So the A nodes are connected with some Poisson distribution with mean AA. The A nodes are connected to the B nodes with some Poisson distribution with this mean. The B nodes are internally connected with some Poisson distribution, and those guys, et cetera. Okay? And so here's one example of the A nodes connected to a random A node. We can also look at the B nodes connected to a random A node and look at the size of the expected component. And we can look at the phase transition properties of it. So we now have some formalism for looking at connectivity through layers. So you can see that these are all Poisson degree distributions, so we really shouldn't have a giant component. If we just looked at one network in isolation, not thinking about how it's connected to other things, we wouldn't see percolation until average degree equals 1. So now by accounting for the hidden connectivity through these alternate layers, we can see where the percolation threshold really is. But that's really not the interesting thing. So we built up this machinery that lets us calculate these things, and there is other machinery that was built up that has some similar flavor. It was done for networks with different kinds of nodes and networks with are modular. But that's not totally the interesting thing. So now we can more accurately figure out where the giant component is. But we can also show that it's more than hidden connectivity, and that wiring which respects groups actually percolates earlier than wiring that doesn't respect groups. So I showed you the A network, the B network, and their probability distributions. And now let's get rid of the flavors. So the probability of observing a node of degree k is summing over all the ways that a node of network A can have total degree k, which would be its Ka degree plus its Kb degree. And likewise for the B node. So I'm going to make the same probability distribution. So I take this thing that had flavors and I get rid of the flavors. And I end up with a simple probability distribution that I can analyze using the standard techniques introduced in 2001. And if I have wiring that respects the node flavors, which is the L2 view, versus the L1 view, I see that the L2 view actually percolates earlier. So this is looking at the size of the giant component as the B network's connectivity is increasing for fixed A network connectivity and fixed internetwork connectivity. And the giant component forms when the L2 view, when the average connectivity is 0.933, for the view that neglects flavors when the average connectivity is 1. And we can also look at the size of the A nodes that contribute to the giant component and the B nodes and show that they're both extensive. So we have both A and B nodes involved in this process. But it happens sooner if we wire respecting flavors. And we can also ask some questions like, how much do I enhance it? So how much bigger is a giant component if I wire with respect to that keeps flavors and preserves them, or it neglects the flavors? And I can also ask, how much can I enhance it? So those are these two next slides. So I looked at the size of the view that preserves flavors, subtracting off the view that doesn't have flavors. Yeah, perfect. And then, so this was for a particular value. And then we also looked at the entire parameter space for interacting Poisson networks. So here we have the connectivity between the two networks. And we look at it as a ratio of R, which is a ratio of their two average degrees. And we see that the maximum that we can enhance it is when they're weakly coupled and when it's bimodal, so that the B network is about twice in size and connectivity as the A network. And I just showed you this for Poisson networks. And we can then go to other kinds of distributions. So we were looking at two interacting power law distributions that are truncated. And we also looked at truncated power laws interacting with Poisson networks. So these guys, they already have a giant component because the gamma is big enough. But we find that the number of nodes involved in the giant component is larger if we respect the wiring with the flavors than if we just wired at random. And likewise, here we actually see the opposite effect of delay, cooperative delay. So if we have Poisson and power law networks interacting, it actually percolates later than if we neglected the flavors. Why I'm interested in these things is that this guy is a little bit related to looking at epidemic thresholds in human populations. So we might think of the US and China and their contact networks. And this would imply that if we fit these parameter regions, that the number of people infected in an epidemic would be larger for the same number of transmissions. Here, this looks similar to critical infrastructure, where we have electric grids that have narrow degree distributions, and we have things like routers, which have broad scale degree distributions. And we find that we actually suppress when giant connectivity happens. So returning to this Erdos-Renyi process, you can now guess what happens, right? Because these are Poisson degree distributions that are weakly interacting. So what's going to happen? So it happens sooner. So this is looking at particular choices of the parameters. And this is the standard standard Erdos-Renyi, and this is when we have modular wiring, and we can show convergence to our predictions from the generating functions as n increases. There's also other choices that give you a lower percolation threshold. So open questions are, how low can we make that percolation threshold? And can we do this with a branching process analysis? So this Erdos-Renyi model seems like it's very amenable to a branching process. The generating functions tell us a little bit about static probabilities, but this looks like it's promising. So I'm hoping someone here might want to help me analyze this as a branching process. So just to wrap up, good. As I said, we're interested in looking at spreading of information or epidemics between interacting populations. So if things interact, the epidemic might have a larger outbreak. We're also interested in trying to think about communication networks. So if you have n nodes that you want to connect up, if you break them into two groups and you wire with different rates within the groups, you can actually achieve a large connected component with fewer edges. And again, I'm interested in these cascading failures through critical infrastructure too. And we're also, final thing, is that we're looking at how random graphs might help us understand real systems, right? So I showed you all these random graphs that neglect any additional structural properties. And we're interested in understanding how real systems differ from the random graphs, and can we use these as diagnostics? So one of the places is looking at open source software. We have email network of developers. We have function calls amongst the code, and we have mapping of developers to the code. And what we hope is that if two developers are editing the same piece of code, they connect to each other directly in the email network. And we looked at how the real network compared to a random graph model. And we found that for most of the time it was the same. So they connected at random. But then there's some structural signatures that we see emerge, and we're trying to figure out what these mean. And I've also been working a lot with people who are building integrated biological systems, so looking at how genes give rise to proteins, which interact with other proteins, which can give rise to metabolites, which might generate proteins, and the proteins can go back to the genetic level and activate or inhibit other genes. So we have systems of interacting networks. We're interested in looking at healthy individuals and diseased individuals and seeing if we can use the differences between them and random graphs as biomarkers. So to wrap up, I started out by showing you a way of getting preferential attachment without needing to assume it as an axiom, as it has been done previously. And it can instead come from optimizing a local trade-off between competing objectives. And then I talked a bit about controlling phase transitions with choice, so delaying or enhancing it, changing the speed of the onset and its universality class, so going from continuous to discontinuous. And finally, network interactions. So by treating networks as modular, we can enhance when connectivity occurs, or we can actually delay when connectivity occurs, depending on the specifics of the degree distributions involved. And finally, we're trying to think about how random graphs might help us understand real-world networks. Thanks.
So could you have different types of functions that allow these different networks to interact to change the onset of phase transitions? Are there different sort of functions that mash different graphs together? It seemed like you were just using two different types of distributions for each of the graphs and then mashing them using a particular...
So we started out, for now, just thinking purely about connectivity. So all we're thinking about is the distribution of edges between these things. So all we're thinking about is degree. Right? So we're thinking about connectivity properties within networks and between networks. So there are probably many other functions that we might think about to augment that. So structural features like clustering, how many triangles are there, correlated distributions of edges.
Yeah. Have you also thought about sort of a more physical chemical scenario, like considering the number of degrees between different things as actually being like an intermolecular chemical bond or something like that, and looking at sort of the onset of statistical mechanics, essentially?
So that's a really intriguing question, because I was looking a lot for bimodal Erdos-Renyi structures. And one of the few places in the literature that I could find discussion of this was looking at polymers. And there was some numerical, or some analysis talking about how polymers tend to have high degree and low degree. So they were this bimodal structure, and it helped the polymer gel.
Yep.
So that would be very interesting.